Everyone, in our previous video we focused on research designs, and we discussed the various types of research design, more specifically the three main types of research design. Now in this video we would focus on other types of research designs, Now research design, what is research design? Now, we learned in our previous lesson that a research design is the conceptual backbone within which a research is conducted. And we also explained that it comprises the blueprint or roadmap for collection, measurement, and analysis of data. So more like, in effect, the research design is more like the roadmap. It's like the guide. It's like a compass within which you are able to collect data or collect information in order for you to be able to answer the various research questions that you asked in your introductory chapter. Okay, so research design is the conceptual backbone within which a research is conducted. And I told you the other time that I like this definition of research design a lot. The conceptual backbone within which research is conducted. Okay, it comprises of the blueprint or the roadmap for collection, measurement, and analysis of data. So you realize that in the chapter 1 or the introductory chapter of the research, we ask some questions under the research questions. Okay, we ask some questions. Now, the idea with the research process is that you want to be able to get information or get answers to those research questions. Now, the process that you are going to observe, the procedures that you are going to observe in order for you to collect data or collect information to help you answer the research questions, those procedures are the procedures that come together, and we call them the research design. Okay, so the research design is more like the blueprint. Okay, it's like a compass that you are going to follow, you are going to observe in order for you to be able to answer the research questions. Okay, you can also say that the research design is an organized plan for gathering and answering data to answer a research question or to test a hypothesis. It entails careful planning of the research procedures, the data collection, the data analysis, the interpretation of the results. Research design helps the researcher to identify the primary goals of the research and to select the best approach to meet these goals. Again, you can also say that the research design refers to the overall strategy utilized to answer research questions. A research design typically outlines the theories and models underlying a project, the research question of a project, a strategy for gathering the data and information, and a strategy for producing answers from the data. Again, you can also say that the research design is the arrangement of conditions for collection and analysis of data in a manner that aims to combine relevance to the research purpose with the economy in procedure. Okay, so these are all meanings of research design. Now, basically, when we say a research design, they are the various procedures and the strategies that you are going to use to get answers to your research questions, to collect information in order for you to be able to answer the research questions. That is what we mean by a research design. Now, in our previous video, we looked at the three main types of research design: the quantitative research design, the qualitative research design, and then the mixed method research design. There are three main types of research design: the quantitative research design, the qualitative research design, and the mixed method design. Now, what is a quantitative research design? You remember that in our previous lesson, I explained that when we say quantitative research design basically focuses on systematic collection and analysis of numerical data. So when you are doing a research and you have certain questions and you realize that you can only answer those questions by collecting numerical data, then you are doing a quantitative study. Okay, so quantitative study focuses or deals with numerical data. Is that okay? Numerical data. Okay, if you want to measure something like prevalence, you would use quantitative study. If you want to understand patterns, trends, you want to do a study, one of your objectives is you want to test hypothesis. The best design to use is quantitative design. So you are doing a study, you want to measure prevalence. You are doing a study, you want to test hypothesis. You are doing a study, you want to look at relationships. You want to understand trends. You want to understand patterns. The best design to use is quantitative design. Okay, now the key thing I want you to focus on here in quantitative design is that it deals with, or it focuses on numerical data. It focuses on numerical data. Now, the qualitative study, on the other hand, focuses on non-numerical data. Non-numerical data. The qualitative study, on the other hand. Now, for qualitative study, if you want to conduct a study, you want to focus on understanding human experiences. You want to measure human beliefs. You want to measure behaviors. The best design to use is qualitative study. Okay, so I mentioned that if you want to do a study, you want to understand, you want to measure patterns, you want to measure prevalence, you want to do hypothesis testing. The best design to use is quantitative. You want to do a study, your focus is that you want to understand the behavior of people, the experiences of people, the beliefs of people. The best design to use is qualitative. Okay, so qualitative studies focuses on exploring and understanding human experiences, behaviors, beliefs, and social phenomena from the perspective of the participant. Okay, great. Now, the data type that you will use in qualitative study is non-numerical data, such as words, observations, visual materials. Is that okay? So, for example, someone have conducted a study. How are you going to know from the person's research report? How are you going to know it's a quantitative study? So someone conduct a study. You know, quantitative study, one of the areas you should focus on or remember is that if you are doing a quantitative study, you'll be allowed to use both primary data and secondary data. But if you are doing a qualitative study, you can only use primary data. Let me go over that again. If you are doing a quantitative studies, you can only use both primary and secondary data for quantitative research. Okay, so when we say primary data, a first-hand data that you are collecting from participants. But when we say secondary, an already existing data. If you are doing a quantitative study, you can use both primary data, first-hand data, and you can also use an already existing data. But mostly in qualitative study, you can only use primary data. You can't say someone have already done an interview. You are going to take that interview and use that to do another study. No. Or use that to do a qualitative study. No. With qualitative studies, you can only use primary data. But in quantitative, you can use both primary and secondary data. Now, another thing, someone have done a study. How are you going to know that they study? They use a quantitative approach. Now, one of the areas that you can factor in is that with quantitative, you see them presenting the results with statistics, like descriptive statistics, inferential statistics. Descriptive statistics, like they will do calculation for mode, calculation for mean, calculation for standard deviation, calculation for variance, hypothesis testing. That is the inferential statistics. You would only see that in a quantitative study. So if someone does a quantitative study, the results presentation, you see them presenting the results with frequency tables, where they will do calculations like the percentages, they will do calculations like the relative frequencies, like they will do calculations like mean, standard deviation, mode, variance. They will do inferential statistics like confidence interval, hypothesis testing, chi-square. All these are under quantitative research, quantitative design. Okay, so if you take someone's research report, you go to the results section, you see graphs, pie chart, bar graph. That should tell you it's a quantitative analysis or quantitative design. Okay, if it is a qualitative study, you don't expect to see things like bar chart, pie chart, or bar graph. You don't expect a qualitative report. You don't expect to see frequency tables. So one of the ways that you can define a quantitative study is by the results presentation, how the researchers have presented or how the researchers can present results. Okay, so in quantitative study, you can present your results using descriptive and inferential statistics. Whereas in qualitative study, you can only present your results using rich in-depth contextual insights. So as if two people have conducted an interview and you are narrating their reports or their responses. You are going to see that in qualitative study. But when we go to quantitative study, the results presentation, you are going to see things like a frequency distribution table, things like a pie chart. You can see a bar graph. You can see calculations like descriptive statistics, inferential statistics, like they trying to calculate mean, mode, range, standard deviation, inferential statistics like chi-square, student t-test, hypothesis. All those things should tell you that the design that was used was quantitative. Okay, but if you look into someone's project report, you don't see anything like frequency tables. You don't see anything like pie chart, bar graph. You don't see anything like any kind of table. You don't see any statistics like descriptive statistics, inferential statistics. That should tell you that the report is likely to be a qualitative report. Is that okay? It's likely to be a qualitative report. Now, another way you can define whether a study is quantitative or qualitative is by the data collection instrument. So if someone does a study, and let's say you've not seen any part of the study, you are only looking at the data collection instrument. If the instrument is an interview guide with open-ended questions, that should inform you that the likely design is a qualitative design. But if someone conducts a study, and then let's assume the instrument is the only thing you are using to measure whether or to determine whether it's a quantitative study or a qualitative study, you are using only the instrument. Now, if the instrument is a questionnaire with closed-ended questions, meaning the researchers ask questions and give the respondents options to choose from, that should tell you it's a quantitative study. Okay, so you see, we have several elements that you can consider to define whether a study is a qualitative study or a study is a quantitative study. Okay, so if a study is a quantitative study, you can also use the instrument to judge. How are you going to use the instrument? When you check the data collection instrument and it's a questionnaire with close-ended questions, structured questionnaire with close-ended questions, that alone should tell you that the study is a quantitative study. But if you look into the data collection instrument and you see an interview guide with open-ended questions, that should also inform you that it's likely to be a qualitative study. So you see, you can use the kind of information that we are collecting to determine or define quantitative or qualitative study. If we are collecting numerical data, quantitative, you can also use the presentation of the results at the end of the day to also determine whether it's a qualitative study or quantitative. How are you going to do that? Now, if you check the results, and then the results, they are presenting the results, they are showing descriptive statistics, inferential statistics like mean, median, mode. You take someone's report, the results section, you see calculations like mean, median, standard deviation. Automatically, you should know it's a quantitative study. Don't expect to see those kind of analysis in quantitative studies. Is that okay? Good. Then we have what we call the MES method. Is that okay? The MES method. Now, MES method is a combination of the two. So in MES method, it means that in that design, we are going to consider collecting numerical and non-numerical data. Apart from that, we will be able to present the results using descriptive statistics and inferential statistics, as well as in-depth contextual insights, like a narrative report. Is that okay? Thematic content analysis. Now, apart from that, with a MES method, you would be allowed to use both primary and secondary data in MES method. Is that okay? You'll be allowed to use both primary and secondary data. Now, again, in a MES method, the instrument is also supposed to be both. The instrument would include a questionnaire with close-ended questions and an interview guide in a MES method. Is that okay? So this is basically what we discussed in our previous meeting. Now, we are going to look at other types of research designs. In health system research. Okay, so like I said earlier, research design is the overall plan or the strategy that guides how a study is conducted. It specifies how participants are selected. That is one. Research design will let us understand how your participants will be selected, how the data is going to be collected, more importantly, how the data is going to be collected in order for you to answer the research questions. Okay, research design also includes how variables will be measured. Will the variables be measured numerically or non-numerically? How relationships are examined, okay, in order for you to be able to answer the research questions accurately and systematically. Now, in health research, research designs are broadly classified into two. In health system research, research designs are largely classified into two. We have the experimental research designs and we have the non-experimental or observational research designs. Now, in health system research, research designs are largely classified into two. Now, apart from the three main classifications, we are looking at other classifications. And what I'm saying is that in health research designs, in health system research, research design can also be classified into two. The experimental or interventional research designs, and we have the non-experimental or observational research design. Non-experimental or observational research design. These are the other classifications. So we have the experimental research designs and non-experimental or observational research designs. Now let's begin with experimental research designs. Experimental research design. Okay. Now when we say experimental research design, what does it mean? Now, an experimental research design is a study design in which the researcher actively intervenes by assigning participants to one or more groups and controls the exposure or treatment to examine its effects on an outcome. Okay, so when we say experimental research design, it's a type of research design or a type of study where the researcher tries to manipulate exposures. That is how we explain it. So the researcher tries to manipulate exposures. What does that mean? The researcher tries to manipulate because, see, in an experimental research design, one of the key characteristics is that there is an intervention we are testing. So the researcher is going to manipulate. So usually, there are two main characteristics of experimental research designs. In experimental research design, groups are created. Okay, groups are created. Now, what do we mean by groups are created? Now, groups are created in the sense that groups are created, usually two groups are created. One group will be exposed to an intervention, another group will be denying exposure. So, this is one condition in experimental studies. One, there is an intervention, that is one. The second thing is that groups are created. So, the groups that are created, usually two groups. One group will be given a certain intervention, another group will be denied. So one group will be given a certain intervention, another group will be denied the intervention. That is what we mean by the researcher try to what? Manipulate exposures. So the researcher try to intervene. There is an intervention. That is one condition of experimental research design. There is an intervention that the researcher wants to test. But in testing the intervention, the researcher will create two groups. Is that okay? The researcher will create two groups. Now the first group is the intervention group or the treatment group, and then they are the group that receives the treatment that is being tested. And then the second group is what we call the control group, the group that is not giving the treatment. Is that okay? Okay, so you see, experimental research design usually have two characteristics, okay, or two key features. There is an intervention that we want to test. That is one. Two, groups are created. One group will be giving the intervention, and another group, the second group, will not be giving the intervention. The group that is giving the intervention, that group is what we call the treatment group or the intervention group. The group that is denying the intervention, we call it the control group. Is that okay? Great. So these are the two. And that is the reason why we say experimental research design is a type of design where the researcher manipulates exposure. You manipulate those who will be exposed to a certain intervention. You manipulate. The reason why we say you manipulate is some people will be given the treatment, others will be denied. So there is manipulation. Okay, so experimental research design is a type of design where the researcher manipulates exposures. Is that okay? That is experimental research design. Okay, now under the experimental research design, we have two types of sub designs under the experimental. The first one is the randomized control trial, and then the second one is what we call the non-randomized control trial or quasi-experimental study. Okay, so we have two subtypes of experimental designs. We have the randomized control trial, or what we call the clinical trial, the randomized controlled trial, or what we call the clinical trial. And then we have the non-randomized controlled trial or quasi-experimental study. We have the non-randomized controlled trial or the quasi-experimental studies. Okay, so we have two subtypes under the experimental research design. The first one, we have the randomized controlled trial, or what we call the clinical trial. And then we have the non-randomized controlled trial or quasi-experimental study, or you can call it community trial, or you can also call it the field trial. So we have two main subtypes of research design under the experimental design, two subtypes of research design under the experimental design. Okay, the first one is the randomized control trial or clinical trial. Then the second type is the non-randomized control trial or quasi-experimental study, or you can also call it field trial, or you can call it community trial. Now, let's look at the first subtype, randomized control trial. Randomized control trial. First of all, you should understand that the randomized control trial is a type of experimental study. Now, why do we call it randomized control trial? We call it randomized control trial because in randomized control trial, it's a experimental research study in which participants are randomly assigned to either an intervention group or a control group. Okay, so what that means is that in randomized control trial, there is a principle we call randomization. What do we mean by randomization? Randomization means that, you see, in experimental study, two groups are created, the control group and then the experimental group, or the interventional group. The control group is the group that will not be given the treatment. The interventional group is the group that will be given the treatment. Now, in creating the group, in randomized control trial, randomization is employed, meaning the participants are given equal chance of being part of either the control group or the interventional group. That is what we call randomization. So the participants are given equal chance to be part of either the control group or to be part of the intervention group. That is what we call randomized control trial. Okay, so in randomized control trial, the principle of randomization is applied. In randomized control trial, the principle of random allocation of participants, meaning the participants that forms the control group and then the interventional group, they are allowed equal chance. So usually they will do some numbering, they will use some random number assignment, then they will do some numbering. Then, so that means that the participants are given equal chance to be part of either the control group or the experimental group. That is why we call it randomized control trial. And that is one of the essential features or characteristics of a randomized control trial. Random allocation of the participants. The participants are given equal chance of being part of either the control group or the experimental group. So a control group or the interventional group. Is that okay? That is randomization. So the principle of randomization is applied in randomized control trial. The principle. So randomized control trial is a type of experimental study in which the participants are randomly assigned to either an intervention group or a control group, meaning in creating the groups, all the participants were given equal chance to be either part of the control group or part of the intervention group. But that principle does not work in non-randomized control trial. That is why we call it non-randomized control trial. And the reason why randomized control trial is very important because it's minimized bias. Is that okay? It minimizes bias. Is that okay? Good. It ensures that the members are given equal chance of being part of the control and experiment, and that minimizes bias. Okay, we have something we call selection bias. Randomized control trial would help to minimize selection bias. It will help to minimize selection. That is one of the key advantage or strength of randomized control trial. It minimizes bias, or specifically, it minimizes selection bias. Randomized control trial. Okay, so randomized control trial is a type of experimental study in which the participants are randomly assigned to either an intervention group or a control group to evaluate the effectiveness of a treatment or an intervention. A randomized control trial. A type of an experimental study in which participants are randomly assigned to either an intervention group or a control group. So you see, the underlying principle over here is that two groups are created. But one of the key features of randomized control trial is that there is randomization. The members or the participants are given equal chance of being part of either the control group or the intervention group, and that minimizes selection bias. One of the strengths of randomized control trial is that there is high eternal validity. There is high eternal validity. It's one of the key characteristics or significance of randomized control trial. Now, the disadvantage or the limitation of randomized control trial is that it's very expensive and time consuming. Okay, imagine you have to create groups. Okay, it's very expensive and it's time consuming. Okay, and you know, because it's an experiment, experimental studies in general actually demands or requires a lot of ethical concerns. Okay, yes, because you see, you are going to give treatment to people, so a lot of ethical concerns actually comes in. Okay, good. And most of the time, because of the principle of the randomization, randomized control trial is not feasible when you want to do a study in a community setting. Randomized control trial is usually not feasible. So we usually do not do randomized control trial when your sample size or your population is very big. You don't do randomized control trial. It's not feasible to use randomized because you see, you can imagine a whole community, like the whole of Eastern region or a whole region. Then you are doing a randomized control trial and you have to do randomization. No, that is going to be very, it's going to be a very stressful and time-consuming process. Okay, so randomized control trial is usually not feasible in a larger setting or in a community setting. So mostly, if you want to do an interventional study in a community, sometimes they will take away the principle of randomization, and that will become a non-randomized control trial. That's the reason why another name for non-randomized control trial is community trial, or you can call it a field trial. Is that okay? So randomized control trial is not feasible in a community setting. Okay, now let's talk about the non-randomized control trial. The non-randomized control trial. The non-randomized control trial, you can also call it the quasi-experimental design. Quasi-experimental design. So the non-randomized control trial is also a type of experimental study, but here the researcher do not use the principle of randomization during the assignment of the groups. So the researcher creates groups, all right, but they don't use the principle of randomization. So the members or the participants, they do not have equal chance of being part of either the control group or the experimental group. That's non-randomized control trial. Okay, non-randomized control trial. Okay, good. Now, the non-randomized control trial is also called a community trial. Okay, or you can call it a field trial. Either non-randomized control trial, quasi-experimental study, or community trial, or field trial. So either you call it non-randomized control trial, quasi-experimental study, field trial, or community trial is the same thing. Is that okay? So when we say non-randomized control trial, the only difference is that in non-randomized control trial, the researcher do not employ the principle of randomization in non-randomized control trial. So during the creation of the groups, the control group and then the interventional group, the researcher do not employ randomization. Unlike the randomized control trial or the clinical trial where the researcher employs randomization. And mostly, randomized control trial is very feasible when the sample size is very small. It's not so large. That's the reason why one of the limitations of randomized control trial is the community setting. It's not feasible in community setting where the population is very huge or where the sample size is very huge. It's not feasible. Okay, but non-randomized control trial is feasible because you see, you don't do randomization. It's the randomization that makes the process very tedious and time consuming. Is that okay? So in a community study where you want to test an intervention, all right, but you want to do it in a community, the best design to use is the non-randomized control trial. Because if you want to do randomized control trial in a community study, that is going to be very tedious and also going to be very expensive. Is that okay? And it may require a lot of expertise. Okay, so non-randomized control trial or quasi-experimental study or field trial or community trial is a type of experimental study in which the researcher introduces an intervention without random assignment. So a quasi-experimental study or non-randomized control trial or field trial or community trial is a type of an experimental study in which the researcher introduces an intervention without random assignment. So there is no randomization. So in quasi-experimental study, there is an intervention, all right, but the researcher do not, employ randomization. Okay, and we usually use non-randomized control trial or field trial or quasi-experimental study in a situation where random assignment or randomization is not feasible. So you want to do a study, you want to test an intervention, but applying the principle of randomization is not feasible, most especially when you have a larger study. In such a situation, you use non-randomized control trial. So you want to do an experimental study, all right. You want to test a certain intervention. Okay, but for some reasons, randomization is not feasible. The best design to use is non-randomized control trial or quasi-experimental study. So, for example, you've gone to a community, a larger community, let's say a whole region, like Eastern region. You want to test a certain intervention. Okay, for example, maybe a vaccine. You want to test the effectiveness of a vaccine. Fine, groups will be created, all right. But then you can't employ randomization because of the population. The population is large. Can you imagine going to take cards, then you number 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2 for a whole region? You can imagine the process, how it's going to be so strenuous and then time consuming. Okay, so in such situations where the population is very large, you can't use randomization. So in such a situation, you have to take away randomization. Then you use what we call non-randomized control trial or quasi-experimental study. Is that okay? Good. So we have experimental study. Basically, when we see an experimental study is a type of study where the researcher manipulates exposures. When we say manipulate exposure, what does it mean? The researcher determines or the researcher creates groups. One group will be given an intervention, the intervention we are testing. Another group will be denied. Sometimes the other group may be given a placebo or an already existing intervention. Okay, so in experimental study, the researcher manipulates exposures. Two groups are usually created. The one group will be given the intervention we are testing. That group, we call it the interventional group or the treatment group. Another group would be denying the treatment. That group, we call it the control group. In some situations, the control group, they give them the already existing intervention or they give them placebo. Is that okay? Such a study is what we call experimental study. We are testing a certain treatment. We are testing an intervention. An intervention can be education. You can go to a community, then you divide the community into two. One group, we would give them education on personal hygiene. Another group, we will not give them education on personal hygiene. Then we monitor them for some years and see the outcome that we are going to get. So we monitor them for some time to get to understand the outcome. Is that okay? Such a study is what we call experimental study. Okay, so experimental studies are very, very, important in health system research. Is that okay? So we have two subtypes of experimental research design. The two subtypes, we have the randomized control trial or clinical trial, and then we have the non-randomized control trial or quasi-experimental design or community trial or field trial. Non-randomized control trial or quasi-experimental design or community trial or what we call field trial. Is that okay? So let's look at, we started by looking at the randomized control trial or clinical trial. What is a randomized control trial? Randomized control trial is a type of experimental study where the researchers, employs randomization during the creation of the control group and the treatment group. The researcher employs the principle of randomization. So it's an experimental study, all right. But the key feature here is that during the creation of the group, the researcher gives all the participants equal chance of being part of either the control group or the treatment group. Okay, so that is the key feature over here. So there is creation of groups, but the key difference is that the researcher allows equal chance. The researcher gives the participants equal chance of being part of either the control group or the experimental group. That is what we call randomized control trial. Okay, so one key thing about randomized control trial is that it minimizes selection bias. That is one of the importance, the significance of the strength of the randomization that is employed. It helps to minimize selection bias. It helps to minimize selection bias. Then we have the non-randomized control trial or quasi-experimental design. So you see, non-randomized control trial or quasi-experimental design, or you can call it community trial, or you can call it field trial. Now, the difference here is that in non-randomized control trial, we do not employ the principle of randomization. In non-randomized control trial, the researcher creates two groups, the control group and the experimental group. The control group and the experimental group. Okay, but then in creating of the groups, the researcher do not give the participants equal chance. The researcher just creates the group. So the researcher will just come and create, okay, this group, you will be giving the treatment. This group, you will not be giving the treatment. Or this group will be receiving the treatment. This group, the researcher do not allow chance. Is that okay? And in such a situation, there can be one of the weaknesses of non-randomized control trial is there can be selection bias. There is selection bias. Is that okay? But then non-randomized control trial is feasible. Okay, good. It's very feasible in a situation where randomization is going to be difficult. In a situation where the population is very large, you can't employ randomization. Then you have to consider non-randomized control trial. For example, you have a larger population. For example, you want to do an experimental study in a whole community with so many people. You can't do randomization. So in such a situation, you do non-randomized control trial. The underlying thing is that over here is still an experimental study. You will still create groups where one group will receive the intervention, another group will be denied. But the key thing is that you did not employ randomization. Okay, that is why we call it non-randomized control trial or quasi-experimental design. Or you can call it community trial, or you can call it field trial. Is that okay? So an experimental research design, experimental research design is a type of design, whereby the researcher tries to test an intervention. And in doing so, they manipulate exposure. All that means is that one group will be given the intervention, another group will be denied. That is why we say they manipulate exposures. One group will receive the intervention, another group will be denied the intervention. Then the next thing that we spoke about is the types of the subtypes under the experimental research design. Now, under experimental research designs, in experimental research design, what happens is that in experimental research design, the subtypes, we have randomized control trial and we have non-randomized control trial. The randomized control trial, you can also call it clinical trial. Non-randomized control trial, you can also call it community trial or field trial. Community trial or field trial. Now, what is a randomized control trial? in a randomized control trial, or what we call clinical trial, okay, in a randomized control trial, the researcher, in creation of the two groups, the control group and then the treatment group or the intervention group, the researcher employs randomization, meaning the researcher gives all the participants equal chance of being part of either the control group or the experimental group. That is what we call randomized control trial. So the principle of randomization is employed. Now, in non-randomized control trial, it's also an experimental study. The researcher is conducting an experiment, testing a treatment. The researcher also creates groups, two groups, control group and experimental group. But the control group and interventional group, or the treatment group. But the difference is that the researcher in non-randomized control trial do not employ the principle of randomization, meaning the participants are not given equal chance to be part of either the control group or the treatment group. The participants are not allowed equal chance of being part of either the control group or what we call the interventional group or the treatment group. Okay, that is what we call the non-randomized control trial. Okay, good. So one of the things you need to pay attention to is that the key characteristics of non-randomized control trial is that there is no randomization. There is no randomization. Is that okay? There is no randomization. One of the strengths is that it's feasible when you want to do an experimental study in a larger population. It's feasible. It will allow you to do an experimental study in a larger population or in a situation where randomization is not feasible. Is that okay? The limitation is that there is high risk of selection bias in non-randomized control trial. Is that there is high risk of selection bias. All right, I think for now we will end over here for our lesson on research designs. So from today, we've learned that we have the other types of research design. We have two main types of research design: experimental research designs and then non-experimental research designs or observational research designs. Experimental research designs or non-experimental research designs or observational research designs. And then we started with the experimental research designs. And the experimental research designs, we have two subtypes: the randomized control trial or the clinical trial. We have the non-randomized control trial or quasi-experimental study, or you can call it quasi-experimental study, or you can also call it community trial, or you can call it field trial. Is that okay? Great. So in this video, we've been able to explore or discuss the types of experimental research design and the subtypes. Is that okay? In our next video, we will concentrate on non-experimental research designs or observational research designs. Okay, until we meet in our next video, I wish you guys all the best. Continue to study, continue to revise your research methods, okay, and do well to share this video to your friends in other colleges and universities who may find this information very useful. All the best. Bye bye.